Why would any pilot attempt such a risky approach when landing? Well, the truth is, when you've flown the same route countless times, it's easy to relax, fall into routine, and maybe let your guard down. But those moments of familiarity can sometimes flip into unexpected danger. What feels routine can suddenly become life-threatening. Today's story centers on Southwest Airlines, the fourth largest airline in the United States and the single biggest operator of Boeing 737 aircraft worldwide. For more than 5 decades, Southwest has relied almost entirely on the 737, and at present their fleet has more than 800 of them in service. One of those planes, a Boeing 737-300 with the registration number N668SW, was assigned to operate Flight 1455 on March 5, 2000. The flight was scheduled to depart from Las Vegas, Nevada, and head to Burbank Airport in Southern California. This was a short hop, usually taking just over an hour from gate to gate, and it was a trip both pilots on duty knew well. The captain, 52 years old, had a background flying in the Air Force, corporate jets, and airliners. He had joined Southwest in 1988 and logged around 11,000 flight hours, most of them in 737s. Colleagues described him as relaxed, approachable, and generally average in flying skills. Beside him sat the first officer, 43 years old, who had joined Southwest 3 years earlier after more than a decade in the U.S. Air Force. He had accumulated about 5,000 total flying hours, half of them in the 737. Other captains regarded him as an above-average pilot, and he still flew the F-16 in the Air Force Reserves, even having done so just 2 days before this trip. Both pilots were well-rested and ready. This was the first flight in a 3-day sequence, and with the captain living in Las Vegas, the day began smoothly. On paper, this flight should have been routine one. The captain had probably flown dozens, maybe even hundreds of times before. But things weren't entirely normal. Unlike the usual dry, stable weather Las Vegas is known for, the skies that day were turbulent. Thunderstorms were reported both near McCarran Airport and along the route to Burbank. Conditions were severe enough to trigger a rare wind shear alert, something almost unheard of in Las Vegas. These storms had already delayed the aircraft that was supposed to operate Flight 1455. The jet was stuck in Los Angeles for nearly 2 hours before finally reaching Las Vegas around 4:30 p.m., almost 2 hours behind schedule. The crew quickly boarded 137 passengers, along with 3 flight attendants, and managed an impressively fast turnaround. By 4:50 p.m., the aircraft pushed back from the gate just 20 minutes after arriving. As they prepared for departure, the crew noticed the aircraft was unusually heavy. Reports later explained that an additional 3,000 pounds of fuel had been loaded. This was a precaution in case they had to return to Las Vegas if Burbank proved unsafe to land. But that also meant the plane would be close to its maximum landing weight when arriving. Takeoff was smooth, with the captain flying and the first officer monitoring. The climb was uneventful, and soon they were cruising southwest over the Mojave Desert. On the way, they navigated around thunderstorm cells and experienced mild turbulence. But nothing out of the ordinary for seasoned pilots. After less than an hour, the descent began. The cockpit voice recorder captured casual conversation between the pilots discussing their careers and recalling a 1988 United Airlines incident in San Francisco that had since become a training scenario. As they neared Burbank, they considered what to expect. And here's where local geography mattered. Burbank Airport is located in the San Fernando Valley. Surrounded by challenging terrain, mountains rise to 3,000 feet to the east, and the Hollywood Hills, reaching 1,700 feet, sit just to the south. The airport has 2 runways. Runway 0826, which runs east-west, runway 1533, which runs northwest-southeast. Because of the terrain, only runway 08 had an instrument landing system ILS, so most aircraft typically used that. Landing on runway 26 was tricky due to nearby hills, so if winds made runway 08 unfavorable, runway 33 was usually the backup choice. At this point, the pilots knew of an 80-knot tailwind on runway 08. The captain remarked that runway 33 would probably be the option. Since he couldn't recall ever using runway 26, he gave a quick briefing, a visual approach to runway 33 with flaps set to 40. But at 6:02 p.m., air traffic control handed them over to the SoCal Trackens Woodland sector. The controller instructed them to expect an ILS approach to runway 08, which was the standard arrival procedure at Burbank. For the captain, this likely felt like a relief after all. The ILS approach was familiar and straightforward compared to the visual approach he had just briefed. Yet despite this sense of normalcy, almost nothing about this flight had been routine so far. Whether it was the weather, the unusual fuel load, or the rushed schedule. And as we'll see next, the idea that this approach would be easy turned out to be a dangerous assumption. If you attach this little device to the back of your phone, just like that, it becomes incredibly useful. It works brilliantly for business calls, or really any important conversation. The makers of Plod are also preparing to launch a new and even more advanced app in early October. With this upgrade, not only will you be able to record audio, but you'll also be able to add images, flag key discussion points, and let the software generate detailed meeting notes. That includes summaries, task lists, and even insights into the flow of the conversation and the intentions of different speakers. It's a powerful tool. The device can record for up to 30 hours continuously. Supports translation into more than 100 languages. And because it's powered by GPT-4, you can search recordings, ask questions about them, and even link everything into your existing work apps. If you'd like to give it a try, you can scan the QR code on screen or check the link in the description or comments. Don't forget to use the code MENTOR10 at checkout for a 10% discount. Big thanks to Plod for sponsoring this video. Now, let's return to the story. At this point, Flight 1455 was about 21 nautical miles north of the threshold of Runway 08, southwest of the Palmdale VOR, and following its standard arrival path. Normally, as aircraft arrive in this area, the Woodland Sector Controller issues radar vectors to help intercept the Runway 08 approach somewhere between 10 and 15 miles from the runway. Air traffic control rules require controllers to provide an intercept angle of 30 degrees or less. That way, the crew doesn't have to make an overly sharp turn onto final approach, which could cause them to overshoot. This usually means controllers guide planes farther west before vectoring them back in for a shallow intercept. But occasionally, depending on traffic, they might bring a plane in closer with a steeper intercept angle. Controllers also have the responsibility of sequencing aircraft safely. That means adjusting spacing between flights sometimes by lengthening or shortening vectors. Other times by giving speed restrictions so faster planes don't overtake slower ones. In this case, another Southwest flight, 1713, was just ahead of Flight 1455. It had been vectored to intercept the approach around 12 miles from the runway. At the same time, a business jet was inbound from the northwest, though still some distance out. The controller's plan was to slot Flight 1455 in between those two aircraft, but if he vectored Flight 1455 to far west, the business jet would close the gap. To prevent that, at 1803, the controller instructed Flight 1455 to turn left to a heading of 190 degrees and descend to 6,000 feet. The first officer acknowledged, and the crew began their turn and descent. Just 30 seconds later, the controller added a speed restriction, maintain 230 knots or greater until advised. This would widen the gap between Flight 1455 and the business jet behind, which was cruising at 210 knots. In hindsight, though, this may not have been necessary since the controller was also about to give Flight 1455 a shortcut. Speed instructions like this are completely normal around busy airports, so the crew likely saw it as routine. They accepted it and continued. But this situation was unique. They were flying heavier than usual, keeping higher speeds, and were about to be given shorter vectors. That mix of factors would soon become a real challenge. Meanwhile, the first officer calculated their approach reference speed ref to be 133 knots at their current weight. Company rules required adding 5 knots for the reported tailwind, making the target approach speed 138 knots. This meant they now had to bleed off nearly 100 knots of airspeed between their position on downwind and the start of final approach. The issue was, they didn't know how long the controller would keep them at 230 knots. Seconds later, the controller cleared them down to 5,000 feet and instructed a turn to a heading of 160 degrees. This placed them on an intercept course to join the final approach path less than 8 nautical miles from the runway threshold, significantly closer than normal. In fact, this clearance, the shortcut given by air traffic control, cut about 6 miles off the approach path the pilots were expecting. This increased the distance between Flight 1455 and the business jet behind them by the same amount, meaning that the earlier 213-knot speed restriction was no longer needed. Yet, for whatever reason, the controller never canceled it. At this point, the crew should have realized that stabilizing the aircraft on approach might no longer be realistic. The safer move would have been to speak up, report that the clearance wasn't workable, and request either more track miles or freedom from the speed restriction. But that didn't happen. To understand why, we need to look at 2 important factors. The concept of a stabilized approach. The company culture at Southwest Airlines at the time, almost every airline worldwide trains its pilots to use the stabilized approach concept. In simple terms, it means that the aircraft should be fully set up for landing gear and flaps extended correct speed. Descent rate under control, power set appropriately, and only small control inputs needed by a specific altitude called the stabilization gate. Typically, that's 1,000 feet above the ground on instrument approaches or 500 feet on visual approaches. If the plane isn't stabilized by that point, the crew is expected to break off the approach and go around. Southwest had its own terminology for this. They called it being in the slot. For them, that meant on the glide path, airspeed within 10 knots of the target approach speed, descent rate less than 1,000 feet per minute. Gear and flaps fully deployed. Power settings appropriate. No excessive control movements needed. The idea was simple: if you weren't in the slot at the gate, you weren't ready for a safe landing, and you should go around. But in the early 2000s, Southwest's culture around this was a little flexible. The airline strongly encouraged visual approaches whenever possible, especially in the American Southwest where the weather was often clear. Visual approaches, however, are harder to stabilize than instrument approaches, because they rely more on pilot judgment and workload tends to be higher. Because of this, many Southwest crews often found themselves slightly outside the slot parameters at 500 feet. Instead of going around, though it was common practice to simply correct those parameters below the gate and continue landing. Part of the issue was that Southwest's manuals weren't crystal clear. Instead of saying, "If you're not in the slot, you must go around," the guidance was softer phrases like, "If you're not in the slot, you're not prepared for a normal landing." That left room for interpretation. Over time, many pilots began to rely less on strict cross-checking of parameters and more on how the runway looked to them during a visual approach. If it looked like they could land, they often went ahead even if the numbers didn't meet stabilized approach criteria. Independent reviews of Southwest's culture later pointed out that this was part of a broader trend, a strong focus on efficiency, speed, and fuel savings. The airline was known for its fast-paced operations, and pilots often carried out slam-dunk approaches fast, steep descents designed to save time. Some pilots even saw these challenging visuals as a way to sharpen their flying skills. To be fair, Southwest wasn't the only airline with this mindset at the time, but the culture did increase risks by encouraging pilots to complete difficult approaches with passengers on board. And while tricky landings can indeed keep skills sharp, aviation safety experts generally agree. Those scenarios should be practiced in simulators, not during commercial flights. Paying passengers who I can guarantee would not vote for their flight being more risky than absolutely necessary. I would also like to add that this behavior exemplifies one of what we in aviation call the 5 hazardous attitudes. Specifically, the attitude known as macho. Macho means an I-can-do-it attitude, with a tendency to show off or a need to prove oneself in the eyes of others, sometimes by taking risks or completing difficult challenges. According to that independent review that I mentioned before, Southwest Airlines also didn't do enough to mitigate the risks of this operating style because its training program failed to include adequate techniques for managing the aircraft's energy state during visual approaches, and it also didn't emphasize the need to properly brief those approaches. Try to remember both of those points, because they are going to become quite relevant soon. Back on board Flight 1455, the pilots now accepted the new heading of 160 degrees, and the captain reminded the first officer that the controller wanted 230 knots or greater for a while. Neither pilot considered asking a TC for more track miles, which actually is another thing that the independent review pointed out, that Southwest pilots were reluctant to respond to air traffic control, that they were unable to complete the clearance, which is also a classic macho trait. Anyway, after a little less than a minute, the controller again called up Flight 1455 to mention the presence of Flight 1713, which was now at their 1 o'clock position 12 miles out, turning inbound towards the approach and descending out of 4,600 feet. The controller also asked if they would like to make a visual approach to runway 08 instead of an ILS approach. And the first officer asked the captain if they should take that offer, provided that they could get the traffic in sight. At the time, the aircraft was still in a layer of clouds, but they expected to break out into visual conditions quite soon, so the captain told the first officer that they would have to wait and see if they could do that. Over the next minute, the pilots told the cabin crew to prepare for arrival, while air traffic control informed them that Flight 1713 was now over Van Nuys at 3,000 feet. Van Nuys is a major single runway general aviation airport located 6 nautical miles west of the approach end of Burbank's Runway 8. This airport presents an obstacle to Burbank arrivals, since it's one of the busiest general aviation airports in the world, with more than 230,000 annual aircraft movements, quite a lot more than Burbank itself. In fact, the Van Nuys VOR, at the northern edge of the airport, sat a well-known navigation beacon. It was an important checkpoint for flights approaching runway 08, and the minimum crossing altitude there was set at 3,000 feet to ensure that airliners stayed above the active traffic pattern at Van Nuys Airport. The runway 08 approach actually passes over the southern tip of Van Nuys Runway. Under normal procedures, commercial flights can descend below 3,000 feet there, but only if they're flying the Instrument Landing System (ILS) approach. In that case, the separation from Van Nuys traffic is already factored into the procedure. Flight 1455 now emerged from the clouds, and the first officer spotted Van Nuys Airport ahead. Moments later, the captain reported that he had visual contact with Flight 1713, the Southwest aircraft, just ahead. The first officer relayed this to air traffic control, and the controller responded by clearing them for a visual approach to runway 08. The only condition was to cross Van Nuys at or above 3,000 feet, since they were no longer on the island. But this instruction was a bit vague. Normally, an altitude restriction is defined as a minimum that must be maintained until a specific point or time. In this case, no exact reference was given, since their flight path didn't actually pass directly over Van Nuys. Some might have interpreted it as clearance to descend as soon as they were abeam, the VOR beacon. Others might have assumed it meant to remain at 3,000 feet until safely clear of the Van Nuys airspace. The captain later told investigators he chose the more cautious interpretation, staying at 3,000 feet until well past the Van Nuys area to avoid conflicting with general aviation aircraft. The downside of this choice was that it left them far above the proper glide path, forcing them into a steep descent later. That in turn made it much harder to shed their excess speed. The safer solution would have been simple: ask the controller for clarification, or request a longer downwind leg. But that didn't happen, and because Southwest crews were so accustomed to visual approaches, being high on the glide path over Van Nuys may have felt fairly routine. It's also worth noting that the earlier 213-knot speed restriction technically ended the moment they were cleared for the approach, but the controller never explicitly said so, and the captain didn't appear to realize they were free to slow down until nearly a full minute later, by which point the plane was already 2 miles west of Van Nuys. At that moment, the captain extended the speed brakes to begin reducing speed and initiated the left turn to line up with runway 08. The autopilot was still engaged, and the crew tuned in the ILS frequency to help the system guide them onto the runway and the line. But the tight intercept angle given by the controller made things difficult. Instead of smoothly capturing the localizer, the autopilot overshot to the right, then corrected back left, crossing over the southern edge of Van Nuys before finally recapturing the centerline. With the plane aligned, the captain called for flaps 5, the very first step in configuring for landing. For context, in my airline, we'd typically have at least flaps 1 set by 10 miles out, and the speed reduced to around 180 knots. But Flight 1455 was still much too fast, and they were already much closer to the airport. Shortly after that, the Woodland controller handed them over to Burbank Tower for their landing clearance. The captain ordered the landing gear extended, which the first officer carried out, and then the captain disconnected the autopilot to fly manual, adding even more workload in a challenging setup. The first officer contacted the tower, reporting a visual approach to runway 08. The tower confirmed winds from 210 degrees at 6 knots, creating a slight tailwind, and then cleared them to land. It was only at this point, just 3 miles from the runway threshold, that the captain initiated their final descent from 3,000 feet. Considering that Burbank Airport sits at an elevation of about 720 feet, the crew needed to lose more than 2,200 feet in that short distance. That required a descent angle of around 7 degrees, more than double the standard 3-degree glide slope. A descent that steep doesn't just mean dropping rapidly, it also makes it extremely difficult to control airspeed. As the aircraft pitched down to lose altitude, its speed inevitably wanted to climb higher. At this stage of the approach, the aircraft was already too fast and too high. To reduce speed in time, the pilots would have needed to push the nose down even further, which was practically impossible so close to the runway. This was the point where it should have been clear to both pilots that the approach could no longer be stabilized, and the correct decision would have been to abandon it and go around. Instead, the captain pressed on, quickly asking for flaps 15 and then flaps 25. Looking down at the flight management display, the captain noticed they had a 20-knot tailwind, far higher than the 6 knots being reported at ground level. He believed this was why they needed such a steep descent, thinking the strong tailwind increased their ground speed. But in truth, their excessive airspeed was the real culprit, because they were descending faster than usual. The captain assumed that simply dropping lower, where the tailwind was weaker, would fix the issue. He then manually adjusted the aircraft into a very steep descent, estimating the path by IA. Seconds later, the Ground Proximity Warning System, GPWS, began announcing sync rates several times. Neither pilot responded to the warnings. The captain simply ordered flaps 30, just put it down. He soon added, go to 48, won't move. I know that, that's fine. Final descent checklist. What he meant was that their speed was too high for flaps 40 to deploy. On the 737, each flap setting has a maximum speed limit. For flaps 40, that limit is 158 knots. Since they were above 200 knots according to the flight recorder, the flap limiting system would not allow them to extend fully until the plane slowed down. Despite knowing they were too fast, the captain didn't seem to realize just how extreme the situation had become. At this point, the jet was flying a dangerously steep path. Alarms were sounding, and it was still 60 knots faster than the safe landing speed. The first officer, whose job was to monitor and call out problems, said afterward that he noticed the warnings and high speed but chose not to speak up. He assumed the captain understood and was already handling it. But standard operating procedures are clear. The monitoring pilot must call out deviations no matter what. The whole point is that the non-flying pilot usually has more capacity to notice issues. Staying silent whether, out of fear or misplaced trust undermines crew coordination and can lead to disaster. So why didn't the captain break off the approach? It appears that every small event reinforced his confidence. The change to the more familiar Runway 08 made things feel easier. Seeing the runway and the aircraft ahead gave him reassurance that a visual landing was possible. When he noticed the tailwind, he told himself that descending faster would solve the problem. From his perspective, the runway picture ahead looked manageable. Even though the aircraft's energy state was dangerously high, what he overlooked was the short, rain-slicked runway, barely 6,000 feet, with no overrun area, only a barrier and city beyond. He ignored the alarms, dismissing them as expected for a steep descent. And when he realized they were closing in on the slower aircraft ahead, his focus shifted to spacing instead of his own unstable approach. Southwest aircraft were equipped with onboard computers to calculate required landing distances in such conditions. Short runway, heavy weight, tailwind, company procedures required their use when performance was in doubt. Had they run the numbers, they would have seen how unsafe the landing attempt really was. But they didn't. Even when the first officer pointed at the speed tape to remind the captain about flap limits, he didn't challenge the approach or suggest going around. He even completed the checklist alone, despite it being designed as a two-pilot challenge and response. That in itself was a red flag of excessive workload and other clear sign that a go-around was needed. As the GPWs kept repeating sync rate, the first officer informed the cabin crew to prepare for landing. Then the system escalated, issuing the urgent pull-up warning. Today, that command always requires immediate escape action. But at the time, many airlines taught that if the runway was in sight and terrain clearance seemed certain, the alert could be ignored. That mindset left the crew blind to the fact that something was seriously, dangerously wrong. Standard procedures require pilots to respond to a pull-up warning instantly, no matter if the runway is visible or not. In this case, however, Flight 1455 was descending so steeply that the aircraft's systems determined it was outside the safe landing profile. To the computer, the descent path resembled a crash trajectory rather than a controlled landing. The captain later claimed he never even heard the pull-up calls, possibly due to the stress of the moment. The first officer admitted he heard them but assumed the flight path was still safe and that the captain had it under control. For a monitoring pilot, that was an unusual and concerning judgment. It raises the question, at what point, if ever, would he have spoken up? Despite multiple alarms, the plane roared past the 500-foot stabilization gate where the approach should have been fully stable without either pilot saying a word. The aircraft was diving at over 1,000 feet per minute, still 50 knots above the proper approach speed, and the flaps were not yet in their full landing configuration. The captain later admitted he should have broken off the approach, but explained that he had become completely fixated on the runway ahead. This kind of tunnel vision, often called get-the-rightus, happens when the goal of reaching a destination overrides good judgment. It's especially common in captains who are determined to complete the landing. That's exactly why airlines rely on first officers to speak up forcefully when things go wrong. But here, the first officer stayed silent. Meanwhile, the traffic ahead Flight 1713 finally cleared the runway, which the captain took as the last obstacle removed. The GPW's warnings kept repeating, but the captain brushed him off with a casual, "That's all right," and the first officer still said nothing. At just 170 feet above the ground, the captain began flaring the aircraft, raising the nose to prepare for touchdown. Normally, the flare begins at about 25 to 30 feet. 9 seconds later, the aircraft slammed onto runway 08 at a shocking 182 knots. Because of the excess speed and steep descent, the touchdown point was 2,150 feet past the threshold, well outside the normal touchdown zone of 1,000 to 1,500 feet. The captain deployed the thrust reversers immediately and applied heavy manual braking, much earlier than he typically would, in a desperate attempt to slow down. But later, analysis showed that, under those runway and weight conditions, they would have needed about 4,700 feet to stop. Only 4,150 feet remained. From the instant reverse thrust was engaged, a safe go-around was no longer possible, and an overrun became inevitable. As the aircraft skidded down the runway, the flaps finally extended to 40 degrees. But it was far too late to matter. People watching from the passenger terminal could see instantly that the jet was traveling much too fast to stop in time. Inside the cockpit, the pilots realized it too. Their earlier calm evaporated into panic and dread. The captain, recognizing the outcome, could be heard on the cockpit voice recorder angrily cursing himself in third person. And he had reason to. At the end of runway 08, there was no grassy buffer or long overrun area. Instead, there was just 32 feet of bare pavement, then a solid blast wall meant to shield traffic along North Hollywood Way, the road that runs directly past the far end of the runway. As the concrete blast wall rushed toward them, the captain tried to avoid a direct impact by steering sharply to the right with the nose wheel tiller. His intention was to angle the aircraft across the ramp and out through an opening in the airport fence. But turning the tiller while braking caused the jet to skid, which reduced the effectiveness of the brakes even more. At 18 hours, 11 minutes and 20 seconds, the right wingtip clipped the edge of the wall, and moments later, the 737 tore through the airport S-perimeter fence at roughly 32 knots, about 60 kilometers per hour. The nose landing gear collapsed as the plane slid across North Hollywood Way, a busy road with 7 traffic lanes. It struck one vehicle directly and scattered debris into several others. And straight ahead stood something every pilot dreads: a gas station. For a terrifying moment, it looked certain that the aircraft would crash into it, likely erupting in flames. But by sheer luck, the jet came to a halt right at the edge of the station's parking lot, beneath its towering price sign. The 737 was heavily damaged, but the fuselage and cabin structure remained intact. Astonishingly, every passenger and crew member survived. Some cars on the road were damaged, but no serious injuries occurred among their occupants. Inside the cockpit, the captain finally seemed to emerge from his tunnel vision, muttering, "My fault." And then, with bitter resignation, "Well, there goes my career." In the cabin, evacuation was briefly complicated when the forward slide accidentally deployed inside the galley, blocking the main doors. Thankfully, passengers were able to exit through the rear and overwing doors. Had there been a fire, this could have been disastrous. But fortune was on their side. All 137 passengers and 5 crew members escaped. Only 2 people suffered serious injuries, while 41, including the captain, sustained minor ones. In the aftermath, the FAA suspended both pilots' licenses for a year, and Southwest Airlines dismissed them. Investigators concluded that the primary cause was the crew's failure to go around when the approach was clearly unstable, too fast, too steep, and with insufficient runway left to stop. Contributing factors included ATC instructions that boxed the flight into an unsafe descent profile. A separate review by the Airline Pilots Association pointed to a broader cultural issue within Southwest at the time, a tendency to normalize risky approaches under perceived pressure to get the job done. This same mindset later contributed to another Southwest overrun at Chicago Midway in 2005. Following these incidents, Southwest made significant changes to training and procedures. And airports like Burbank also upgraded their safety infrastructure. The gas station near Runway 08 was removed, and an EMAS-engineered materials arrestor system was installed at the runway's end. In fact, in 2018, that very EMOS successfully stopped another Southwest jet from running off the same runway, proof of how far safety has progressed. Although no lives were lost in the Flight 1455 accident, it stands as a stark reminder of how close disaster can come. Had the touchdown been just a little faster or further down the runway, the story could have ended with unimaginable tragedy at that gas station.